That last number is 4,210,500,000,000 in less than 3 years. This is not a rounding error. This is not a data anomaly. This is what happens when a government, a legitimate, elected, democratic government, in one of the most educated and industrially advanced nations on earth, loses control of its own money. The Weimar Republic of Germany is the definitive case study in economic collapse. It is studied in every serious economics curriculum on earth. Its hyperinflation has been cited as contributing evidence in every monetary policy debate of the last 100 years. And yet most people who know the name do not know the mechanism, do not understand how it started, why it was allowed to continue, and what it set in motion. Because what came after the hyperinflation is the reason this story is told at all. The inflation did not cause Adolf Hitler, but it destroyed the institutions, the savings, and the social trust that might have stopped him. That distinction is everything. Chapter 1. How Germany Financed the War. To understand Weimar's inflation, you must first understand a decision made in 1914, before the Republic existed, before Weimar was anything more than a city in Thuringia, known for Goethe and Schiller. When Germany entered the First World War in August 1914, the imperial government faced an immediate fiscal problem. Wars are expensive, and Germany's reserves were not sufficient to finance a conflict it expected to last a few months, but which would last 4 years. Every major power in the war faced this problem. They solved it in different ways. Britain raised taxes and issued war bonds. The United States, entering the war late, levied an income tax and sold Liberty bonds to the public in massive patriotic campaigns. Both countries emerged from the war with significant debts, but debts owed to their own citizens, denominated in their own currencies, backed by functioning tax systems. Germany made a different choice. The imperial government decided not to raise taxes substantially. Raising taxes was politically unpopular, and the war, after all, would be short. Germany would win, it would extract reparations from the defeated powers, and it would pay its bills from the proceeds of victory. To finance the war in the interim, Germany suspended the gold standard, the system by which each mark in circulation was backed by a specific quantity of gold held in reserve. It began printing money to pay for military expenditure, and it issued war bonds to its citizens with the implicit promise that victory would make them good. Germany did not win. In November 1918, the imperial government collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. A new, hastily assembled democratic republic, named for the city in which its constitution was drafted, inherited a country that had been running its finances on the assumption of victory, had lost, and now owed an amount it could not begin to calculate.
Chapter 2. Versailles and the number that couldn't be paid. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, contained a provision that the German delegation accepted under protest and that every subsequent German government, democratic and otherwise, would spend the next 2 decades attempting to escape. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned full responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies. It was the legal foundation for what followed. What followed was reparations. In 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission set the total German liability at 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $33 billion at the time, or by some contemporary calculations, approximately $400 to $500 billion in today's money. The number was, by almost every serious economic analysis of the time and since, impossible. John Maynard Keynes, the most important economist of the 20th century, resigned from the British delegation at Versailles in protest and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, arguing precisely that the reparations figure was not designed to be paid. It was designed to be politically satisfying to Allied populations while economically strangling Germany. Keynes wrote in 1919 that the reparations would not be paid in full, that Germany lacked the productive capacity, and that attempting to extract them would destabilize Europe. He was correct on both counts. Nobody listened. The Weimar Republic made its first reparations payment in 1921. It immediately became clear that regular payments of this scale could not be sustained from tax revenues alone. The government returned to the tool it had used during the war. It printed money. 1919. German government deficit financed almost entirely by money creation. 1920. Money supply doubles. Prices begin rising. The middle class notices. 1921. First reparations payment made. Money supply doubles again. 1922. Inflation accelerates. The word hyperinflation does not yet exist. At this point, a reasonable question arises. Why did the government keep printing? The answer reveals something important about the political economy of inflation that remains relevant today. Printing money was, in the short term, politically easier than the alternative. The alternative was austerity, cutting government spending, raising taxes, accepting unemployment and economic contraction in order to stabilize the currency. That path was available. It was taken, eventually, by Hjalmar Schacht in 1923, and it worked in the narrow sense that it stopped the inflation. But in 1921 and 1922, no government that proposed it could survive the political consequences of implementing it. The Weimar Republic was a democracy under siege. It faced violent opposition from both the far left, communist uprisings in Bavaria and Berlin, and the far right, the Kapp Push of 1920, multiple assassination attempts on government ministers. In that environment, the government chose the path of least immediate resistance. It kept printing. Chapter 3. What hyperinflation actually feels like. The word hyperinflation has a technical definition, a monthly inflation rate exceeding 50%. Weimar Germany did not merely meet this threshold, it shattered it. At the peak of the crisis in October and November 1923, prices were doubling approximately 3.7 days. Statistics of this magnitude are difficult to hold in the mind. So consider instead what they meant for the individuals living through them. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by November 1923. Workers demanded and received daily wage payments because a weekly salary lost meaningful value between Monday and Friday. Some employers paid twice a day. Wives and family members would meet workers at factory gates at lunchtime to run the morning's wages immediately to market, because by evening, those same notes would buy less than half as much. Restaurants stopped printing menus. Prices changed between courses. A diner who ordered a meal at one price would be presented with a bill for a higher one, not from dishonesty, but because the kitchen had received a delivery at a new cost while the customer was eating. The social destruction was not uniform. It had a very specific shape, and understanding that shape explains almost everything about what followed politically. Debtors benefited from hyperinflation. If you had borrowed money before the inflation began, you could repay that debt in depreciated currency, sometimes at the peak for essentially nothing. Farmers who had taken out mortgages found themselves debt-free. Large industrial concerns with significant fixed debts effectively had those debts wiped out. Hugo Stinnes, the most powerful German industrialist of the era, borrowed heavily during the inflation and used the proceeds to buy physical assets, mines, steelworks, newspapers, whose value appreciated in real terms while his debt evaporated in nominal terms. He died in 1924, one of the richest men in Europe.
Creditors were destroyed. If you had saved money, if you had worked for 30 years and placed your savings in a bank account, in government bonds, in any paper instrument denominated in marks, you lost everything. The German middle class, the Mittelstand, had been the most disciplined savers in Europe. They were also the most completely ruined. A family that had saved 100,000 marks over a lifetime found those savings worth, by November 1923, approximately 1 American cent. The inflation did not impoverish Germany equally. It transferred wealth from savers to debtors, from the professional middle class to industrialists and landowners. It was a redistribution of historic scale, carried out not by legislation, but by monetary failure. The psychological effect on the German middle class was not merely financial, it was a fundamental rupture in the social contract. These were people who had trusted the institutions, the banks, the government, the currency itself, and had been told that diligence and saving were the foundations of a decent life. The inflation proved that the institutions had been wrong, or had lied, or simply had failed. The trust, once broken, did not fully repair. Chapter 4. The Ruhr Crisis, when France made it worse. In January 1923, Germany defaulted on a timber delivery required under the reparations agreement. The French government, led by Raymond Poincaré, used this as the legal basis for an action it had been contemplating for some time: the military occupation of the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract reparations payments directly. The Weimar government's response was to call for passive resistance, a general strike in the Ruhr, funded by the government, to deny France the industrial output it sought. The workers of the Ruhr downed tools. The French occupation produced nothing, and the German government paid approximately 40 million unemployed and striking workers for doing no work, entirely by printing more money. The Ruhr crisis lasted 8 months. By the time passive resistance was called off in September 1923, the monthly inflation rate had reached figures that strained the capacity of mathematics to communicate. The Reichsbank was printing banknotes so rapidly that it ran out of printing ink and had to contract with private printers to keep up. Some municipalities issued their own emergency currencies, not Geld, because the national currency arrived from Berlin in denominations so large they were useless for small transactions. August 1923. Monthly inflation rate, 755%. September 1923. Monthly inflation rate, 2,536%. October 1923. Monthly inflation rate, 29,525%. November 1923. Peak. Prices doubling every 3.7 days. On the 15th of November 1923, the Rentenmark was introduced. 1 Rentenmark exchanged for 1 trillion old marks. The hyperinflation ended, not gradually, but almost overnight. This fact is itself extraordinary and is rarely discussed with the seriousness it deserves. The inflation stopped because Hjalmar Schacht, the new head of the Reichsbank, simply stopped printing money. He restricted credit. He cut government expenditure brutally. He accepted the unemployment and the economic pain that came with stabilization. It worked. Within weeks, prices stabilized. Within months, the economy began recovering. The lesson that hyperinflation is a policy choice, sustained by political will or its absence, and ended by political will, is one that monetary economists have returned to repeatedly in the century since. The inflation did not end because Germany ran out of things to print. It ended because someone chose to stop. Chapter 5. The Years That Worked and Why They Didn't Last. From 1924 to 1929, Weimar Germany experienced something that is often forgotten in the larger narrative of collapse. It worked. The Rentenmark stabilized. The Dow's Plan of 1924 restructured reparations payments into manageable annual installments backed by American loans. Foreign investment flooded into Germany. Industrial output recovered. Unemployment fell. Berlin became one of the most culturally dynamic cities in the world, the center of modernist architecture, expressionist art, and a nightlife that scandalized and fascinated the rest of Europe in equal measure. This recovery is important to understand because it is often erased by the knowledge of what came after. The Weimar Republic was not permanently broken by the hyperinflation. It recovered. Its institutions, the Reichstag, the courts, the civil service, the free press, continued to function. Its democracy, though imperfect and under constant pressure, held. The recovery was, however, built on a foundation that was structurally precarious in ways that were visible to serious observers at the time. The German recovery of the mid-1920s was financed primarily by short-term American loans. The Dow's Plan and its successor, the Young Plan of 1929, created a circular flow of capital. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to France and Britain, and France and Britain used that money to repay their own war debts to the United States. The entire system depended on American capital continuing to flow. It was, in the language of contemporary finance, a carry trade of civilizational scale, borrowing short at low American interest rates, paying long-term obligations in European currencies, with no hedge against the scenario where the American capital stopped flowing. In October 1929, the American capital stopped flowing. Chapter 6. The Depression arrives. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 triggered an American recession that rapidly became a global depression. American banks, facing liquidity crises at home, recalled their loans to Germany. The short-term capital that had underpinned the Weimar recovery evaporated almost immediately. German unemployment, which had fallen to 8.5% at the end of 1929, rose to 14% in 1930, 21% in 1931, and reached 30% by early 1932. By some measures, accounting for partial employment, the effective unemployment rate was higher still. 6 million Germans, in a country of 65 million, had no work. The Weimar government's response to the Depression was governed by the recent memory of inflation. The absolute priority of the surviving political and financial establishment was to avoid any recurrence of monetary instability. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented policies of severe austerity, cutting government spending, raising taxes, accepting deflation, in conditions where these policies made the Depression significantly worse, driving unemployment higher and tax revenues lower in a self-reinforcing spiral. Brüning was fighting the last war. He was so determined not to repeat the inflation of 1923 that he implemented policies which ensured the political conditions of 1933. The trauma of hyperinflation made the trauma of fascism more likely. The Reichstag, the German parliament, became ungovernable. The coalition governments of the Republic's middle years could not form stable majorities in conditions of mass unemployment and political radicalization. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany was governed primarily by emergency decree under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, a provision designed for genuine national emergencies that was instead used as a substitute for parliamentary government. The institutions that had seemed to function in the relative prosperity of 1925 to 1929 proved brittle under sustained economic pressure. Not because they were designed badly. The Weimar Constitution was, by the standards of its time, a sophisticated and thoughtful document, but because no institutional design survives the combination of mass unemployment, a traumatized savings class, and a political culture that had lost faith in the system's capacity to protect ordinary people. Chapter 7. How democracy fails, step by step. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, received 2.6% of the vote in the Reichstag elections of May 1928. Germany was in the middle of its recovery years. Unemployment was falling. Weimar's democracy, for all its fragility, was functioning. In the elections of September 1930, 14 months after the Wall Street crash, the Nazi Party received 18.3% of the vote. It was the second largest party in the Reichstag. In July 1932, at the depth of the Depression, it received 37.4%, the largest share any party had achieved in the Republic's history. The relationship between economic desperation and political extremism is not a simple one, and serious historians resist monocausal explanations. The Nazis were not voted in by the unemployed working class. That constituency went predominantly to the communists. The Nazis were voted in primarily by the Protestant rural middle class, by small business owners, by civil servants, by the professional classes, precisely the people whose savings had been destroyed by the inflation of 1923, and whose livelihoods were threatened by the Depression of 1930 to 1932. These were people who had twice in a decade watched economic institutions fail them catastrophically. They had trusted the currency and watched it become worthless. They had trusted the recovery and watched it evaporate. They had trusted the parliamentary system and watched it produce paralysis. The Nazis offered them something that the Republic could not: absolute certainty in conditions of absolute uncertainty. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933, not through a coup, not through violence, but through a legal appointment by President Paul von Hindenburg, who had been persuaded by conservative advisers that Hitler could be controlled, that he could be used as a popular vehicle for the right's agenda, and that once in office, his radicalism would moderate. These advisers were wrong on every count. Within 6 months, the Weimar Republic had been legally dissolved. The Reichstag had passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler dictatorial powers. All other political parties had been banned, and the institutional architecture of German democracy, built painstakingly between 1919 and 1929, had been dismantled from within. Democracy was not overthrown in Germany. It was surrendered by people who believed they could manage a demagogue, contain his excesses, and restore order when it suited them. They could not. Nobody ever can.
Chapter 8. The Economic Lesson That Was Never Drawn. In the decades since 1945, the hyperinflation of 1923 has been the dominant intellectual inheritance of German economic policy. The Bundesbank, the West German central bank established after the war, was explicitly designed around the memory of Weimar. Its primary mandate was price stability. It was constitutionally independent of government. Politicians could not instruct it to print money. This institutional memory shaped the euro. The European Central Bank was modeled substantially on the Bundesbank: independent, inflation targeting, prohibited from directly financing government expenditure. Germany's insistence on these constraints during the ECB's design was not abstract ideology, it was the inheritance of 1923. And yet, the lesson drawn was incomplete. Germany remembered the hyperinflation. It did not fully remember what produced the conditions for Hitler's rise: the decade of austerity after stabilization, the short-term foreign debt financing the recovery, the catastrophic unemployment of the Depression years, and the brittle institutions that could not survive sustained economic failure. The lesson that was drawn: never print money. The lesson that should also have been drawn: build institutions that can absorb economic shocks without destroying the social trust that democracies run on. That second lesson is harder to institutionalize. It requires sustained investment in the things that make ordinary people feel that the system is working for them: employment, housing, savings, healthcare, a future.
Without those things, the currency's stability is irrelevant. Stable money in an economy where ordinary people cannot afford to live is not a success. It is a different kind of failure, slower, less dramatic, but just as politically corrosive. Chapter 9. The Pattern That Repeats. The Weimar Republic existed between 1919 and 1933, 14 years. In that time, it survived hyperinflation, political violence, attempted coups from both left and right, a foreign military occupation of its industrial core, and the catastrophic withdrawal of the American capital that had financed its recovery. It did not survive mass unemployment in a context where the population had already once watched its savings be destroyed by institutional failure. That combination, economic desperation layered onto pre-existing institutional distrust, was the specific mixture that made extremism viable. No serious analyst argues that contemporary Western democracies are on a trajectory toward a repetition of 1933. The institutional safeguards are more robust. The international architecture that constrains national governments is more developed. The memory, at least in Europe, is still alive. But the pattern that made Weimar vulnerable is not unique to Weimar. Institutional trust is not a fixed asset. It depreciates when institutions fail to deliver the basic economic security that ordinary people need to believe the system is worth defending. It depreciates faster when a previous failure, an inflation, a financial crisis, a pandemic, has already damaged the account. Every democratic government that allows economic institutions to serve financial elites at the expense of ordinary savers is making a small withdrawal from the account of social trust. Weimar made so many withdrawals so quickly that the account was empty before anyone noticed. The central bank that protects savers, the fiscal rules that prevent debt from being monetized, the labor market that gives ordinary people a stake in stability, the social insurance that makes unemployment survivable rather than radicalizing. These are not nice-to-haves. They are the load-bearing walls of democratic governance. Weimar's tragedy was built room by room, wall by wall, as each of those structures gave way under pressure that was, in each individual instance, manageable, until it wasn't. In November 1923, a 1 trillion mark note was worth less than the paper it was printed on. In January 1933, the most advanced democracy in continental Europe handed power to a man who had been in prison 18 months earlier for attempting a violent coup. Between those two sentences lies a decade of decisions, each individually comprehensible, many of them taken by intelligent, well-intentioned people doing what seemed possible in the immediate circumstances, none of them sufficient to prevent the outcome they were all trying to avoid. Weimar Germany is not a story about stupidity. It is not a story about evil, or not primarily. It is a story about the specific and fragile conditions that democratic governance requires to survive, and what happens when those conditions are degraded, gradually, until the system cannot absorb one more shock. The conditions are a currency that people trust, an economy that gives ordinary people a stake in stability, institutions whose competence is demonstrated, not merely declared, and enough memory of what failure looks like that the population recognizes the early stages before the late ones arrive. Weimar Germany lost those conditions between 1919 and 1932. The rest of the story is the most documented, most studied, most cautioned against sequence of events in modern history, and it still happened. That is the cautionary origin, that is why it is told, and that is why it must keep being told in every generation to people who did not live through it, and who, if the conditions are maintained, never will. Thank you for watching Macro Atlas. Subscribe. The next biography is already being built.